Tonight's program on addiction and families will be presented by Dr. Lynn Kleiman-Malinoff. Lynn is the director of Eastern Michigan University 21st Century Community Learning Center's Bright Futures out of school time programs. She has worked with challenged youth and their families, teaching, counseling, and leading for over 40 years in K-12 education, as well as developing and directing an adolescent outpatient program for substance-involved youth and their families. Please join me in welcoming Lynn.
Hi everybody, a big shout out to the Dawn Farm folks who organized this education series. It's a nice opportunity for the community to come together and to get some information and to ask some questions. I thought before I start this time I would ask you all what expectations you might have coming into a talk about addiction in the family. What do you want to learn? I mean, is there anything special that you're hoping to get here tonight? Okay, so you're making it really easy. No expectations means gonna be great. Yes, how the spouse is affected. So you'd like to learn how the spouse is affected. And they are. Okay, we will talk about that. Anybody here to hear more about the children? Okay, so we got spouses, children. How about friends? Sponsees? Okay. Yeah, so we'll cover that. And then I'm gonna be mindful of the time. I have a lot of slides, but you know, you can make it go a little faster so that we have time for a discussion afterwards. We can take questions along the way if it's burning and you think it's not going to be answered. Sometimes, because I do go over sort of addiction and then the family and the roles and all that stuff, you're welcome to stop me if you have a burning question. Okay, just raise your hand and do this or dance, something to get my attention. Okay? So, you know, they ask me to come back every year. I've been coming for a while. I don't know how many years, but when I listen to my bio and she says, oh, she's been doing this for over I wrote that bio. I have been in education for over 40 years. So that seems pretty daunting because I feel like every day I'm learning new things and it just always feels quite new in spite of all that I know. I want you to know that I have a lot of expertise, but the more expertise you feel you develop, the less you feel you know, right? So some of you may all have some things to teach tonight too at the end during the discussion, and I look forward to that. My education background was initially in special education. Later on, I worked in alternative high school. I don't know if any of you went to an alternative high school, kind of a last chance high experience. So a lot of the kids were children of alcoholics. In fact, almost all the kids at that program were children of alcoholics. That was the unifying common thing, right? Which is fascinating if you think about it, that we don't know how to accommodate children of alcoholics who are acting out and struggling very well in the public setting, and that's a different lecture, but something I'm still trying to think through. I did direct a treatment center in the 80s, back in the day when we had lots of treatment for adolescents. Most of it was inpatient. I started an outpatient treatment program in Livonia. We were pretty successful. But I got called back to the school district to do alternative ed, and I thought, I want to catch the kids in the education setting, because most of those kids won't make it to the treatment program, so maybe I could do more. And now I'm a project director of this ginormous project that does out of school time programs in 25 schools in Ypsi, Romulus, and Wayne Westland. So happy to discuss that with anybody after. Pretty great because we can do a lot of stuff with kids when they aren't in classes and they don't feel the pressure that comes along with that. And that's the environment I work in now. I always put a special thanks to Claudia Black up here early in the 80s when I was first starting to work with this at-risk population, and I pretty quickly noticed that they were parent impaired. So I mean, I used to say that, you know, they would be called emotionally impaired or learning disabled, but the truth was every time I'd meet the families, the parents would have some sort of difficulty, and often it was a problem with drugs and alcohol. So I began to get more educated, and part of my education was the material that this woman produced in the 80s, Claudia Black, who wrote a book, It Will Never Happen to Me, which is about being a child of an alcoholic and sort of the dynamics of the alcoholic family. So I got my understanding of the dynamics initially through her work. And later in my career, I got to know her and spend time with her and continue to be in touch with her. So it's a shout out. And if you're the child of an alcoholic yourself and you want to read a seminal work, her work is today every bit as good as it was back then. Also a shout out to my family. I don't come from an alcoholic family, which led me to a whole lot of therapy to try and figure out why I married them, not at the same time, but two, which was fortunate, because you know, one at a time's already hard enough, but two, seriously. Those are my kids. This is sort of the extended family. This is my parents. My father just passed away a few months ago, but a super wise man, taught me a lot, super supportive. And that's the family I grew up in. And this is my husband and myself. And I will say I'm allowed to break his anonymity somewhat, that we are both in one 12-step program or another. And our family has been for 29 plus years. And so I can talk from both sides, you know, sort of the professional side of this is kind of how it plays out, but also from the, and this is what it looks like, because I know, because I've been there. This is Katie. I also have permission to show her picture. She was, had children who were in high school when she graduated from high school, but she was one of those kids at the alternative program who was the child and is the child of an alcoholic, who taught me so much. Right, and was just sort of, I mean, so I'm still in touch with her, and I went to her graduation, and there she was, you know, in her late 30s, graduating from high school after all that time, because she still didn't give up on showing her children that there was more, and she's doing pretty well these days, and her kids are great. So. You know, I learned as I've become a more mature woman, thus the gray hair, mature, that I should know whose shoulders I stand on when I'm talking, when I'm writing, when I'm teaching. And so when I show you the picture of my family, and I show you the picture of Katie, and I show you the picture of Claudia, it's to honor the people who have taught me what I know. So I mean, there were a whole lot of other teachers and reading and books and whatnot, but those people were really significant. So we're going to do an overview of chemical dependency and go over some definitions. I'll try and roll through that pretty quickly because you have the handouts, and I'm not going to do it from memory. I'll cover a few points. You've got the explanation with you. We're going to talk about family and the effects on family, and then just kind of talk about some things that family members can do. Yeah, so, you know, addiction does not play favorites. It doesn't identify a specific group and say, okay, these people, these are going to be the alcoholics, right? The poor people are going to be the alcoholics. The whatever religion people are going to be the alcoholics. It doesn't pay attention like that. It is a disease. It is not, it doesn't play favorites with one group or another. I will say that there are some groups who have become more prone to it because of being introduced to alcohol later and then creating a very rapid sort of alcohol problem, as with the Native American population versus the Europeans who had been at alcohol. And I don't really know the science of that, but I do know about that. And you can investigate that further. When I'm speaking today, I'm not going to make any real difference between alcohol and drugs. We're going to talk about substances and dependency. Nicotine is separate. It's a gateway drug. It's super problematic in terms of it being a gateway drug. It's not always a gateway drug, but it is frequently a gateway drug for people whose brains are wired to be addicts. And you know, it's a real problem. You should go to the pain lecture, because I know both Mark and Carl, because it exacerbates pain like crazy, nicotine. So, you know, it's all chemistry, right? It's all chemistry, and it all kind of fits together. So addiction is a primary illness. It's chronic, and it's progressive. It's a brain disease, so it's about the reward system and the reward pathways. When I take a medication, a pain medication, it makes me nauseated, tired. I feel horrible. When a drug addict takes the same medication, they clean the garage, they sweep out the attic, they go dancing, they go to the movies, and then they take some more, and then they do some more. Okay? Their brains do not process it the same way as people who do not have the predisposition to addiction. So so just to say, it's important to know that there's a lot more science, and I am not an expert in the science. I've seen lots of lectures. I don't remember all the science. There's a lot of it, but it is science, and it is neuroscience, and it is all about the brain and the reward system. It's characterized by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, it's a loss of control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems. Alcoholics and addicts don't, they can't really measure something that's a problem very well. They don't have insight. Their behavior and interpersonal relationships become problems, and they have a dysfunctional emotional response. So they don't respond emotionally like people who don't have that problem. Like other chronic diseases, it involves cycles of relapse and remission. I remember when I was starting the treatment program, and I was working with an MSW who had a lot more experience than I did with addiction. I had a lot of knowledge, but not as much experience. And she said to me, and one of the kids relapsed pretty quickly, and she just pulled me aside and said, if you can't handle relapse, you got to get out of the business, because it's part of the disease. And so that's important to know, right? It's important to know. Not everybody relapses, but it's not uncommon to relapse. It's not good to relapse, but it's not uncommon. It's a tough disease. Without treatment or engagement in recovery activities, it's progressive, and it can result in a disability or premature death or prison, right? Something bad's going to happen over time. It's got signs and symptoms. It's chronic, progressive, and fatal. Those are the things that make it a disease. Okay. I'm a big fan of knowing this if you are around addiction and alcoholism. Because you know, if somebody's got cancer or if somebody's got diabetes, you don't get mad at them for having cancer or diabetes. You try and grow some compassion and see how you can support them. Well, cancer is a disease because it's got signs and symptoms, it's chronic and progressive, and it's fatal if it's not treated, and sometimes fatal if treated, as is addiction, by the way. So I can kind of detach from that criticism if I know that the person's sick and not bad. So if they have a disease, they're sick. Okay, it took me a very long time to get to that, though. You can know that intellectually, but to operationalize it takes a lot of practice. Here's what happens. People who have that predisposition, they develop tolerance. So, you know, I would talk to the kids in my program, and they would go, in the alternative high school I worked in, and they'd say, well, then I don't have a problem. I can drink 6 beers. I don't even feel it. I can drive. I know, I'm okay. Well, so most people, if they drink 6 beers, they feel it. They might throw up. And maybe I don't have the right number. I never drank beer. Is it 6 beers, 12 beers? I don't know. Does it really matter? Okay. But, you know, if you drink a lot of beer and you're not an alcoholic and you haven't developed that tolerance, you're going to get drunk. But if you develop tolerance, it gets harder and harder and harder to get high, right? Chemically dependent people, they crave drugs and they don't feel normal without them. Obviously frequent intoxication, but there are people who are binge users and might just use on the weekends. That's another one. I only use on the weekends. How much do you use? And then they tell you and they go, and you're not dead? Holy cow, right? But they manage to not use for 4 days and then use for 3 days. Okay, but that doesn't mean they're not an addict. They're prone to blackouts. Blackouts are a symptom. Anybody ever know somebody who came to you and said, wasn't that great last night? I had such a good time. But you remember watching them throw up, pass out, right? Get in a fight with their girlfriend, and they don't remember any of it because they were in a blackout. There are behavior changes when they use, and things start to go awry. They might miss work. They don't follow through on an obligation, and certainly their family relationships become very compromised. They got legal problems, all kinds of legal problems. They increase the amount they take because they're what? Tolerant, because they're tolerant. So like, can't get drunk on 6 beers anymore, I need 12 beers. That's tolerance. Inability to cut down. So a great deal of time is spent just keeping the stuff coming, right? Finding the drugs or buying the alcohol or making the money to be able to do that, or getting somebody to go out and do it, whatever. But the supply, protecting that. And this is what makes it different. This is when you know the person's really got a problem. So if the person goes out and gets a DUI and they stop drinking, they're probably not an alcoholic. But if the person goes out and gets a DUI, which is a pretty serious consequence in this day and age, right? And then they go out and drive after they've been drinking, they have a problem. Right? In spite of the negative consequence, they went out and did it again. Has anybody ever observed that in somebody they know? Yeah, I mean it's, yeah. Right? Right? It's like, what were you thinking? Well, it's not about thinking, it's about having the disease. This is what people do who have this disease. They continue despite negative consequences. Being arrested, losing their job, getting divorced, getting one DUI, then a second DUI, now they have big legal troubles, and then still they're drunk at the bar and they got to get home and they got the car keys and they go, right? So if they have the car keys after 2 DUIs, sometimes they don't. They really get pretty hijacked, their thinking and their belief systems. The moods are very, very reactive to the drugs or lack of drugs. They can't imagine life without drugs or alcohol. They just can't imagine it. So they don't. They have a lot of obsessive thoughts, and their primary love relationship evolves to the alcohol and the substance. That becomes primary. Not the husband, not the wife, not the children, not the significant other. The alcohol first, and then all those other people. That's a pretty hard one to take if you're living with an alcoholic. It's chronic, right? So the symptoms come up and they last over time. The developmental cycle is very disrupted. So children who start at age 10 or 11 to use substances, it's not uncommon, by the way, their development, if they're developing into an addict, their personal development just stops at age 10, right? So if they start using at 10 and now they get busted and they end up going to some sort of support and they're going to stop using at 18, they have the social behavior and mind of a 10-year-old. It's very complicated. They don't ever quite get it back, and they don't ever quite get back to normal. It could begin with an acute event. Over time, these problems just become routine. This is their life. So there are stages, right? There's an early, middle, and late stage. At the early point, it may just look like there's not too much going on, then something else happens, but it's slow to go. And then in the middle, you start to see real consequences. But by late stage, it's just like it's all the drugs and alcohol. You know, the whole focus, everything dances around that. And the symptoms become very, very obvious and pronounced, and everybody pretty much knows it, but the person who's got the problem, they might not. So it's fatal. So we talked about that. I mean, they could get in a car accident, they could become suicidal from drinking a lot of alcohol, which is a depressant, right? Homicides, violence, there's just all kinds of ugliness, and it does often overdose, suicide, diseases related to drug use, right? Dirty needles, whatever. Okay, it's brain disease. I said that, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is what the family looks like when there's someone in the house who's, you know, an alcoholic or addict. They're just held hostage by this disease, right? It's really hard to shake loose from the patterns when you have this going on day in and day out in your household. So I'm going to there's a few quotes pulled from the literature, and I am going to talk about 12-step recovery because that's what I know best. There's therapy, there's a lot of things, and we'll talk about those different things. But I pulled stuff out of the literature because I have a very healthy respect for Alcoholics Anonymous and the early work done by Bill W. and Dr. Bob and the folks that saw what needed to happen for people to get sober back then. And so the years of living with an alcoholic is almost sure to make any wife or child neurotic. The entire family is to some extent ill, right? That's the taking hostages part. So, you know, family, what's a family? This is the primary social group. There's all kinds of configurations now. It's parents and their children, but again, there are lots of configurations, and if that family is not functioning, then kids tend to create their own families. Gangs tend to replace family systems. So people look to be part of a family and to be supported. And it comes in lots of different varieties. You know, we were just talking about, I had the Bill Cosby family up there for a long time, but then I forgot to take it out. Last year it went up and it was like, oh my God, Bill Cosby, what was I thinking? Okay, I took him out. So there are lots of common features of the families who are dealing with chemical dependency. And one is they kind of develop these unique roles, and they can shift from role to role. So you can kind of occupy more than one role, but playing the roles, that's what they get good at, playing the roles. They have rules. Some of them are spoken, some are unspoken. We're going to talk about those. They have a set of values and beliefs, and they have a shared history. Now, their perception of the shared history might be different from person to person. In fact, it's usually quite different from person to person. You know, 4 people in the same room, something happens, 2 weeks later they describe it and they're not describing the same thing because everybody has their own experience. And depending on what roles they shift in and out of that experience is then affected by that. So families are systems, you know that, right? Like a family is a system when you teach, a classroom is a system, the school is a system, the church is a system, but a family is a sort of a smaller system. And it's operational, it works a certain way until something changes, right? That ripple in the pond. And then suddenly the rings are moving out and things are starting to morph. So the roles shift. And the responsibilities change, right? So when I had a kid who didn't show up because his 6-year-old brother was sick, he had the flu, and the parent was unable to take care of the 6-year-old, that kid doesn't go to high school because they're home taking care of the 6-year-old. That's a shift in responsibilities, right? Rules are broken, all kinds of rules are broken. The values and beliefs of the family are upended. Things that you never thought you would do, suddenly you're doing to protect somebody, to have things go some certain way. Denial sets in. It just sets in. The historical stuff and all the things you learn, it all just kind of falls apart. So, you know, it changes how you feel about being in your family when the chemical dependency advances, when the person gets sicker. People start to communicate in very non-traditional ways, not the way they communicated before the problem. How the families relate to each other and get along is completely held hostage by the person who's got the problem, but also by the roles that we choose to take on, because we don't know any different and it feels like the right thing to do, but things just start to not work. A lot of conflict, a lot of craziness. And then how family members deal with problems and conflict. A lot of them, sweep it under the rug. Do they have a big fight? How do they deal with all this conflict? And usually it's rather dysfunctionally. How they meet each other's needs, how they assume roles and meet the demands. All of this stuff, how family members relate to the outside world. And when you see the roles, you'll maybe begin to identify some of the ways that we might relate differently in the outside world based on the roles that we take on it within the family. I know I see that played out with my staff, because now I'm more working with younger educators. I see it play out in their programs with the youth. And another quote, "The alcoholic is like a tornado roaring his way through the lives of others. Hearts are broken, sweet relationships are dead, affections have been uprooted, selfish and inconsiderate habits have kept the home in turmoil." Selfish and inconsiderate's pretty common with an alcoholic or an addict. Again, it is symptomatic of the disease. Now, just because something's, I want to say this out loud in case it's not in a slide, just because something's symptomatic of the disease doesn't mean it's okay. Right? So I'm going to talk about things that are symptoms. It explains it, but it doesn't condone it. It just explains it. So all the things that can happen, right? Go to the emergency room, like frequent trips to the emergency room, car accidents, arrests, job loss, right? Lots of bad things start happening, major consequences. So then, the person who's chemically dependent can't live up to the commitments or the promises, so they feel inadequate. I mean, and so I'm going to speak sometimes as if I really know how it feels to be an alcoholic. I'm not alcoholic. But I've probably heard somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 open talks, stories that alcoholics share at open meetings. So I actually am kind of an expert. So this is just from hearing those stories, that these are things that you hear over and over and over and over again. I lived in fear. They don't look like they live in fear. They look sometimes angry and powerful and aggressive. And really it's all coming out of a fear. They're afraid, right? And that is a symptom of the disease, fear. Broken promises, lots of broken promises. Members of the family are constantly having their hopes dashed, just dashed. And so having expectations for someone who's sick with this disease is problematic. You expect them to love you, you expect them to come to dinner, show up at 6 o'clock, you expect them to come home with a paycheck, you expect, and then over and over, disappointed, which creates resentments, right? You see the cycle. So here are some of the characteristics of an alcoholic family system. So again, interchangeable, alcohol, drugs, whatever. Actually, turns out there's this thing called chronic pain syndrome. That'll be in the pain lecture, but I know some about it. But chronic pain syndrome is people for whom pain has become, it behaves a bit like addiction, and so the family dynamics look a lot like this. So it's interesting. So go to that pain lecture. Did I say that? So the alcoholic is front and center, right? And they have denial. It's not that bad. If it was bad, I'd get help. I don't need help. Look at him. He's so much worse. Inconsistency, insecurity, and fear. But inconsistency, they seem great for about 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden they're back to, the behavior that's really difficult to live with. A lot of anger and hatred, guilt, shame, blame, resentment, all that stuff. A lot of shame. It brings misunderstandings, fierce resentments, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents. Anyone can increase the list. I mean, it's dire. I don't think this is an exaggeration from the AA Big Book. I think Really, these are the things that happen. And nobody signs up for this. The alcoholic doesn't sign up for it, and the family members don't sign up for it, because it's a disease. Just like people don't sign up to be diabetic, they don't sign up to get cancer, they don't sign up to have a respiratory illness, unless they're smokers. Okay. So this is kind of what it's like for for somebody who's living with an alcoholic, right? They actually believe it's an apple. Right? I mean, they have themselves talked into things that are unbelievable. They believe they don't have a problem is the same as thinking that banana's an apple. When they have a DUI and they've been to the ER 4 times and, you know, they had a big battle with their kid who ran out of the house and hasn't come back for 2 weeks. I mean, it's an apple. They can't see what's going on. There's plenty of anger and hatred. And we talked about guilt and blame. Usually the pattern is that the addict there'll be a situation the addict will go like this and try and convince you it's your fault. So there's a lot of blaming because they're fearful about taking responsibility. And there's a lot of embarrassment. There's a lot of, go to some open talks. Oh my God, there are stories you couldn't possibly make them up. You couldn't. I mean, Hollywood writers couldn't come up with that stuff. They probably all go to open talks to get their material. And there is this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, which is super confusing to families. Because sometimes the alcoholic is just the most loving, wonderful person, and you want to be with them, and you think everything's going to be okay, but then it's not. And that just happens over and over and over again. And the way the family reacts is to pretend that elephant is not in the living room. We just don't talk about it. We don't want the neighbors to know. We're surely not going to go out in public with this thing, right? Resentment's building up, building up, building up. I love this definition. It's like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die, right? So you get a resentment towards them, and you get real focused on that. Now you're sick from them being sick. It just doesn't work very well, but that is the common reaction. There are family rules, and there are 3 of them. There may be more, but these are the ones that are just a constant in dysfunctional families in general, but very graphically visible in families that have chemical dependency. Don't talk. In other words, you don't talk about the problem. You don't go out and talk to other people about it. Kids get smacked for doing that, right? They come home, they talked about their dad hitting them the night before. Now the social worker's calling, and they are in big trouble for talking about what happened, right? They don't trust. Well, why do you think they don't trust? Anybody have an idea why they don't? The family members just don't have any trust, not for each other, not for...
Continual disappointment.
Continual disappointment. You know, the dad says, let's go to the movies. I'm going to come home from work, we'll grab a burger and go to the movies. And never comes home, goes to the bar. And the poor kid's been sitting there for 3 hours really thinking that dad he could show up. No, I'm going to stay here. He could show up. And he doesn't show up. And he doesn't show up. One kid I knew who was a young kid, he was, you know, in later elementary school, was taking an art class, a family I know, and the dad was supposed to come pick him up after the art class, and he wasn't allowed to walk home in the dark from this community building. And he just stayed and stayed and stayed, and finally, I mean, he'd been there for hours, he finally walked home and thought he was going to be in just terrible trouble, right? And really, when the other spouse got home, the other spouse was like, oh my God, you know, because the dad forgot. He was out getting high. So do you think this kid's going to trust him? No way. No way. And don't feel. So it's okay to be angry usually, actually. That's the one feeling that anger tends to be okay. Not that anybody likes it, but it gets expressed a lot. But certainly being happy about something, or being too sad about something, or too upset about something could get you backhanded. You know, or sent to your room, or, you know, like a big angry dispute because you were showing an emotion. So kids tend to shut those emotions out and then deal with it as adults. I hear it's quite hard to do. And you ask these kids, well, how do you feel today? Fine. Well, what does that mean, fine? Well, I feel fine. I'm okay, right? And actually then when you put them, if you put them in a group and you give them a list, you know, that we used to have emojis, they were drawings, it was before the computers. So now I look at the emojis, I go, oh, we used to use those, but it was this sheet that had all these faces and different faces on, and then the word that described the feeling. And we'd give them the sheet and they'd look at it and they were dumbfounded that people had all these different words that would describe how they feel, because the only way they felt was angry, okay, or fine. It was the only things they knew. So here are some ways that family members reduce the stress. They ignore the problem. Maybe if I close my eyes, it'll go away, right? They use defense mechanisms. That's perfectly normal. And for children, these are defense mechanisms. They're there for a reason, to defend themselves, right? It's a way for them to defend themselves from further harm. So, you know, they'll have denial or minimization. You know, my dad's just not that bad. You know, my dad's okay, he just forgot. And they do a lot of approval seeking. They could do some victimization. They take on new roles, right? I talked about the roles. We're gonna look at those. So here are the family roles. And know that one person could take on two different roles. The roles can switch, but these are the things. These are how the roles that can be describe how people behave. So there's the family hero. So the scapegoat, the lost child, the mascot, and the chief enabler. So the hero are people like Bill Clinton, who became president but was the child of an alcoholic, right? Now, that's a very graphic one. There are much less graphic ones, like the kid who gets all A's in his class, or the kid who gets not just good grades, but gets the certificate of, you know, citizenship, citizen of the week in school, because they're so well behaved because they help other children, right? So lots of different ways. Lots of heroes, hero behavior becomes people going into professions and doing really, really hard work in school and becoming professionals so that it looks good on the outside, right? And then the family can just say, well, there can't be anything wrong here. My son's valedictorian. There can't be anything wrong here. My Boy Scout son just got his what is it, Eagle Scout. So the heroes do those kinds of things so that people will focus on that and not on the dysfunction of their family. So high achievers, they have tremendous amounts of anxiety and feelings of inadequacy, which they don't talk about, you know, but I'm not that good, but everybody thinks I'm good if I can just keep up that look of being good. A lot of self-blame. It's a very lonely place for a lot of these young people, and for adults who grow up, were those young people and then grow up. And as an adult, they have this unrealistic sense of control. Like, if I'm super achiever, super successful, then everything will be okay, right? And they need to control, so they have to get an A, they have to get that job, they have to get published, they have to, you know, be the foreman, they have to, whatever it is. And they're overly responsible, and yet they might act very irresponsibly when they're overwhelmed. Okay. The scapegoat. So the alternative high school, that Last Chance High, that was a school filled with scapegoats. All of them. Bad actors. Made lots of choices to do behaviors that would get lots of attention, and that took the heat off the real problem at home and put the heat on them. And they were fine with it. That was their role. What does it look like? These are, I love those kids. I mean, they test the limits. They're super assertive in doing very creative things that often are rule-breaking things. They use inappropriate language. They sometimes dress in very, kind of loud ways or alternative ways. And they are usually, they have the most realistic picture of the family. They actually get what's going on. Well, of course I behave like that. Have you met my family? Right? But how the family deals with it is our problem. The reason our family's like this is because Johnny is, has his nose pierced, he's got purple hair, he's failing school, and he's out with a gang. A lot of anger, a lot of confusion, and a lot of feeling of being out of control. So kind of the opposite of the hero. Instead of like feeling like he got to control, they're just out of control. And then as an adult, they're usually, they're often, not usually, but often substance abusers, and they go down that same path, and they get involved. They get arrested more than the other roles, right? We had a lot of kids with legal problems who were. It's not all kids who are scapegoats, but it's quite a common thing for the actor out. The kid who decides to be the one that acts out, who ends up being the one that acts out, is the one that may end up with legal problems. And they offer the family a sense of purpose. They provide someone to blame and, rally around. We can't do that. We have to go deal with him. We have to go to court. We have to go to this class. We have to, whatever. We have to meet the principal. And there's the lost child. And I remember I taught first grade, my first year teaching, and I remember 3 kids from my classroom that I now believe were these kids who just hid out. I almost didn't notice them till the end of the year when I had to do, in the end of the semester when I had to do the report cards, because they just are super quiet, don't make waves, pretty adequate students in school, and they just, they try and disappear. So it's kind of the opposite, right, of the scapegoat. They're quiet, they're daydreamers, they tend to get in their own world. They're lonely, they're fearful. It's hard because they isolate, so they're very, very lonely. And they don't feel worthy, they don't feel adequate. That's true of most of the children, most children of alcoholics. And as an adult, they can often present with depression, right? And some social anxiety because they have isolated so much. So they offer the family a sense of relief and success because they're no trouble. They're really no trouble. And they're really they're almost invisible, actually. And then there's the mascot. So we had some of these in the alternative program too. We didn't have too many of the heroes, in fact, but we had mascots. So what does a mascot do? They're like the class clown. So in the family, when things are spinning out of control, they'll say something that gets everybody laughing. They'll fart, they'll make a face, they'll tell a joke, something to break the tension. And they get really good at it, and they get into a lot of trouble when they're students because they do it at the wrong time. But they're hysterical. So a lot of comedians, do you know this, are children of alcoholics because they get really fast on their feet with humor, and they make it a living. Robin Williams was one of those. And he also had other issues, right? Because he was depressed, he had addiction. But they still have that anxiety. They measure themselves on how other people see them and like how funny they can be. And then they have that range of hurt and anger. And that, again, children of alcoholics just have those emotions, that hurt, that anger, that fear. That's pretty common. Now, as an adult, they do have problems in school and at work. They have more of a challenge forming intimate relationships because they make jokes so much. They can't get there. They're too busy breaking the tension. And they do end up being kind of the life of the party, and they may develop sex anonymous problems. I'm not so sure where that comes from data-wise, but it's because they become, again, pleasure seekers, where they can break the ice and they don't have to get too intimate in terms of a long-term relationship. They struggle with that. So again, they offer the family comic relief from pain, and their timing, this is why they become comedians. This isn't like they all become comedians, but a lot of comedians come out of that. Their timing is impeccable. And comedy is all about timing, right? So they have a lot of really good practice. So they made lemonade out of their lemons, right, these comedians. So chief enabler looks like that. So what a chief enabler does is make sure that everybody's okay at the cost of not really intervening on the problem, right? So just be sure you get everything all organized so that in spite of this problem, we're kind of functioning the best of my ability. So not intervening on the problem so much as just kind of keeping it all together. So they shelter and shield the person who's using, and then they try and minimize all the consequences for everybody else. They don't have a whole lot of space in their life for themselves because they have a lot of work to do to protect all the other people. It's actually a full-time job. They tend to blame others for the problems, and sometimes they'll sabotage progress towards recovery because their lives kind of revolve around this sort of organizing and being sure everything goes okay. And so then if something starts to get better or worse, then that interrupts their having it all organized and together. Feelings, anger, hurt, guilt, resentment. See, those feelings don't change too much from between one role or another. But it does give and I will say it offers the family a sense of stability and protection. And I think when I actually played that role, I didn't know the things that I know now. I didn't know any of the things I know now, like none of them. And so I was just doing my best to keep it all together. I was making bad choices in terms of whether or not things would get better in that household, but I thought I was being helpful. So the motives were all coming from the right place, but I was being held hostage by the disease, and my motives didn't really match the situation, right? My motives weren't going to make that situation any better. So 1 in 4 children live in a home where alcoholism or alcohol abuse is present every day. That's a lot of kids, don't you think? If I have a classroom of, if I have a classroom of 24 kids, 6 of them are in that situation right off the bat, I can just assume. Now it might be 10 and it might be 3, but that's the average, and it's a problem. It can be, and also reinforce, like it doesn't have to be, the using person for this dynamic does not have to be a spouse. It could be a child. The same dynamics come up and develop. Could be a sibling, right? So it's, okay. So just a little bit of statistics. 3 times more likely to be verbally, physically, or sexually abused if a kid lives in a home where there's chemical dependency, because of course those behaviors are erratic and come out, and usually the person is drunk or stoned, and their brain's not working, right? It's hijacked. 4 times more likely to be neglected, and 4 times more likely to develop their own problem with chemical dependency. So what we used to do in the schools, and it's just not talked about as much now, but we used to just say to the kids, just wait. If you feel like you got to drink and your parent is alcoholic, and we know this already, just wait. Hold off as long as you can. So at least developmentally, if they waited until they were 18 or 19, if they could get them, if they had a problem and it developed and they got sober, they would developmentally not be in such a bad place, right? If they could hold off till they're 25 when their brain's more developed, more fully developed, that'd be even better. But 18 is a lot better than 10 or 14, right? We'd tell them it was better not to use it all, but we were trying to be realistic. It's kind of like telling an alcoholic to never drink again. That's why they do it one day at a time. Because that's just a ridiculous concept for somebody who can't see themselves functioning without alcohol or drugs. So these kids are at risk to have emotional problems, all kinds of physical problems, and learning disabilities, learning problems, learning issues, learning challenges, challenges socially. But when they go to the party, they're going to find somebody When they grow up and they go to the party, they're going to find somebody who's got that problem, because it's going to be like putting your old bedroom slippers on, and it's going to feel really comfortable. And you just find each other, right? Of course, sometimes it doesn't come out so good. So we do end up repeat. If we don't disrupt the pattern, it doesn't matter what the pattern is in any kind of behavior. If you don't disrupt the pattern, you're likely to repeat the pattern. So how it looks in chemical dependency is, if you have it in the family and you go out, you're going to look for more of that, because that's what feels normal if you haven't been intervened on. So if your child has a problem with drugs or alcohol, what do you do? So that came up over and over again when I was giving this talk. So I went to people who I knew were in recovery but had children who had problems with addiction. And I asked them, if you're a parent, what do you do? Well, I mean, you have some recovery. What would you tell a parent to do? If a parent comes to me and says, what should I do? Because I actually don't have a kid who's an addict or an alcoholic. And this is what they said. It's horrible to have an alcoholic husband, but way more difficult and confusing to have an alcoholic child. Because you are the primary person. You're supposed to take care of your children, right? So like, how do you draw those lines? How do you intervene? It says, Al-Anon helped in the process of helping get him in treatment without blame or shame. Interventionist really helped us. Give them the dignity to experience the consequences, and as parents, recognize the consequences as good news. What that means is, like, if your kid gets busted and arrested, let them suffer the consequences of that arrest and don't go bail them out. Right? I mean, that's one scenario, but that's what it is. More wisdom. Kicking her out saved her life. I mean, can you imagine? Some of you do, and some of you know. Sometimes you kick your kid out because they won't get with the program, they won't accept any help, and they need to become somewhat desperate to get some help. Someone told me to go to Al-Anon. Took me 6 months from the time of kicking her out to go back to Al-Anon. Then I got healthy. In the middle of all of it, the important thing for me was recognizing that when things unfold, the consequences of their use and action, those consequences are good news. So again, when there are consequences to the negative stuff that happens to an alcoholic or an addict, and especially to a young person, to allow them to suffer the consequences and feel that negativity may motivate them to get the help they need, right, to get sober. I don't need to make the connections for them. Those consequences are the motivators. From a recovering young son, God and Mom are alike. They both never turned their back on me. That's a family that's been in recovery for a little while. So is there hope? Yeah, lots of it. Lots of it. So what's a family to do? First, you have to develop an understanding and understand the concepts of the disease. And then there are these 3 C's, which are super helpful. I didn't cause it. It's a disease. You can't cause somebody to have diabetes or cancer, right? It's the same thing. You can't cause somebody to be an alcoholic. Nothing you did made a person an alcoholic or an addict. They either are or they aren't. Their use would kick in the mechanism that would make the disease happen. Can't control it, and it can't cure it. You can write that down if you never heard it before. Very useful. This is what it feels like to have someone you really love be an addict or an alcoholic, right? It feels like you have the whole world on your shoulder. It's really difficult, and it's really challenging, and it takes a lot of work to get yourself healthy. But this is what it's like to be in recovery. So if people get involved in a recovering community, this is what it's like. And some people recover in other ways. Right? They recover through the church, kind of looks like that too. They might recover through some sort of mediated thing with a medical intervention. But for the most part, in community. I was at a treatment program, went back for a family revisit 30 years out, went back for a family revisit. So at that point, you go back because you want to give something back to the people who are coming in, because when you come in, there are people who've been there for a while, and they all sound like Yoda. Like, seriously? Like, that could happen? Oh my God. Oh, that person, how'd they get like that? I'll never be like that. But then, over time, if you stick with it, you actually learned a lot, and you can share that. And so what they talked about, they said the opposite of alcoholism is community. I like that, because I've seen so many people get well in community, where other people just understand what's going on. So they accept you. There's no judgment. So it's a systemic disease. It needs systemic treatment. Chemically dependent families have choices. They can break those unhealthy cycles. It doesn't matter why the roles were developed. They don't have to be maintained. So this is what AA's Alcoholics Anonymous says about recovery. The alcoholic may find it hard to establish friendly relationships with his children. They cannot seem to forgive and forget. In time, they will see he is a new man, and in their own way, they will let him know it. From this point on, progressive will be rapid. I've seen this happen over and over and over and over and over in families, in hundreds of families. And there are, of course, millions of families, but I can't get to all of them. So what about if you have an addicted child, or you're the spouse of an addict? What can you do? So I always tell people, it's a great idea to seek professional help. Go talk to somebody who knows about this stuff and listen to what they say. You don't have to like it. You don't have to buy it in the end, but try and get some perspective. See if you can switch the lens. Like, what does this person look like if I believe it's a disease? What does it look like if I believe they're a bad person? What does it look like if I believe they're weak? Switch those lenses around, then decide which one you're going to stick with for a while. I will tell you, I've done all those, and the one that's a disease makes it a lot easier to start to get some help. Because I recognize, I can't do anything about that, so now what can I do? I can put my own oxygen mask on. And maybe if I get healthier, the other person will be motivated to do something about their problem. Because I'm not going to enable them anymore. The definition of enabling is getting between a person and the consequences of the choices they make. So I've been the chief enabler. I know what that means. But that helps me clarify. So if my kid calls and he wants some help, and what he wants is some advice about something, or he wants a loan because he wants to do something, but he didn't spend all his money on something foolish, or, and I have money, I decide I'm not getting between him and the consequence of anything. I can choose to give him the loan or not the loan, but I'm not giving him a loan to bail him out of jail. I'm not giving him a loan to pay off debt that he couldn't pay because he was buying drugs. That's enabling. You can attend Al-Anon, Families Anonymous. I'm happy, I don't give a big Al-Anon. There is an Al-Anon panel, I think, that comes in as part of the series. But I have 29 years in Al-Anon, and I'm happy to talk to anybody after the meeting about that and kind of meetings and the meeting landscape in town. I am a different human being, and I am a different boss as a result of this. I am a different mother. I am a different daughter. Everything about me is different, and I would say it's much improved from the old, much better. Even I feel better about it, but everybody else feels even better. You can learn about codependency and enabling. You're here tonight. That's great. You're going to learn some things. Go learn some more. There's books about it. There's people to talk to. I just gave you the definition of enabling. Doing for someone something he or she should be doing for him or herself, right? Engaging in actions that ultimately perpetuate someone's problematic behavior. So like, calling in sick for somebody, picking them up after the party, picking them up off the floor and putting them in bed, all that stuff. So this is from How Al-Anon Works, which is kind of the big book of Al-Anon. We who live or have lived with the problem of alcoholism understand as perhaps few others can. We too were lonely and frustrated, but in Al-Anon we discover that no situation is really hopeless, and that it is possible to find contentment and even happiness whether the alcoholic is still drinking or not. None of this promises that the alcoholic's going to get sober. By the way, if the people in the household get well, the alcoholic might get well, but they might not, because it's a disease. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, you can't cure it. So I forgot to bring my Q-tips. So get a Q-tip, put it in your pocket. The next time an alcoholic says something ridiculous to you, just don't take it personally. Quit taking it personally. So one of the groups I was in, we just carried Q-tips around for a really long time so that we wouldn't react, to that stuff. Because it's never about the non-alcoholic, even though they make it sound like it is. It's not. It is not personal. They're just being sick. The family situation is bound to improve as we apply the Al-Anon ideas. Without such spiritual help, living with an alcoholic is too much for most of us. Our thinking becomes distorted by trying to force solutions, and we become irritable and unreasonable without knowing it. And this is what happens in an alcoholic family, is you become irritable and unreasonable, and you don't even know what's happening, and it's sort of coming out sideways in everything you do, like with your friends and at work, and you're not even aware of it. So it is work. The battle against alcoholism has become the basis for many of our relationships. Putting an end to this battle requires completely redefining what we believe about ourselves, others, and our relationships. So this is tough. This is difficult work, right? So love the person, hate the disease. Love the person, hate the disease. It's a good mantra. Love the person, hate the disease. Because there's a rainbow at the end of this for those who seek it. But it's work. It's work. So now we have time for questions. So yes, in the back. Oh yeah, Q-tip stands for, okay. So Q-tip stands for quit taking it personally. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of the really bad habits that alcoholics and addicts have is to kind of push the problems off on other people. But actually this Q-tip thing works for those of us who are very reactionary, works on everybody. Like when somebody's had a bad morning at home, they come into work and they're kind of miserable to be around. That's not about you, right? So carry Q-tip and then you won't react to their stuff. If you don't react to it, they stop doing it, by the way. Yeah, so that's what the Q-tip is for. So I love that. I didn't make that up. I stole that. Andrea Switch, she made it up. I stole it from her. And so I have watched, I can't remember science stuff. Like I did okay in science because I could study for a small part of it, but like if you asked me 6 months later to explain it, not so good. But I've been to many, many neuroscience lectures about pain and trauma and addiction. And there's so much neuroscience that supports where this comes from. Now the trauma will actually create some pathways that are not so good. But the addiction thing is a certain center of the brain that's triggered, and if you got it, you got it. I don't have it. Because I went to school, I went to college in the late 60s and early 70s. Trust me, I don't have it. Can that happen? Can a kid grow up in a family that's not alcoholic, but they have that predisposition? Sure. Sure. Sometimes there's somebody who just develops it and they don't have any family history. Also sometimes skips a generation. And these patterns skip a generation. So there's a whole body of knowledge about children of alcoholics, but also grandchildren of alcoholics, because the patterns develop and then they become parents with those patterns, and it feels like an alcoholic family there's no alcohol. And it came from the previous experience, the previous generation, from when they were children, and they carried it into their parenting. Like having alcoholic families you grow up in, and then 2 children of alcoholics marrying and doing a whole lot of work so that there wasn't alcoholism in the family, and then one of the children has alcoholism. Yeah, I mean, because it's, remember the big brain? It's a brain thing. People don't choose to be alcoholics. They just don't. Why would you choose that? It's tough stuff, you know? Yes, sir. So that's really great. So you have chronic alcoholism and you are really nervous about your grandchildren. And so, that thing I talked about not using, so there's this guy, Jerry Moe, whose father was an alcoholic, got sober. I think he was a physician, so he was part of the Recovering Physicians Network. And Jerry never drank. And so he never found out You can look him up. He does Children of Alcoholics. And you could call him and he would talk to you about your question. But nobody can like do anything about the brain. You got it or you don't have it. But what we did with our children was educate them. Right? They went through, there are programs, I think some treatment programs may still have them, for children to go through to understand what alcoholism is. And then they do talk about choosing not to use substances. And then, you know, with my kids that I had back in the day in the schools, I just would say to them, it's best not to use it all to find out. But for sure don't use right now because your brain's developing. So please, put it off. None of them put it off. That's how much control I had. Right? So I think the fact that people become sober, like become a sober alcoholic, become the example to those children who have a problem, and those children know where to go when they're willing to accept the help. And it's a beautiful thing, and I've seen that happen a lot. Like I'd had enough, so I went to my Uncle Charlie, who I knew had been in AA, and I could just ask him, and he took me to a meeting, and the rest is history. Because Uncle Charlie was out about his alcoholism and his recovery. So, I mean, it's an anonymous program, and you have to protect people's anonymity, but you don't have to be anonymous yourself if you don't want. Sometimes you need to choose to be anonymous, so you have to play with that, right? But in our family and within that recovering community, it's nice to see that play out, and we see it play out generation after generation after generation, where family members show the children the way, that there's hope, and that you can get sober, and that you can have a good life. So that's a great question. Is there any difference between kids who do Alateen and kids who don't do Alateen? So it's really interesting. You know, they're anonymous programs. There's no research on any of it. There's very little research on AA. There's very little research on Al-Anon. I know one of the alcoholics was telling me about a brand new sponsee who said, well, you know, I'm going to meetings, but what's the evidence base? This guy's a scientist. What's the evidence base? To which this other person who's been sober for a long time turned to him and said, there's 300 people in the room who are sober. That's your evidence. Right? So what I have noticed from the kids I know who went to Alateen and then became adults is they actually know about the 12 steps, and they know how to get help if they need it. Right? I mean, that's the gift. That's the gift you can give them. You know, I know my son said to me, I got this friend, you know, she came over to a gathering in my house, and then she came out of the bathroom, and there was a needle in the bathroom. You know, she was shooting up. He said, so I don't know, would you talk to her, get somebody to talk to her? It's like, I'm not an addict. I'll get an addict to talk to her. So my son at the time was a barista. I show up to get a coffee. He knew I was coming. I said, I'm gonna be downtown, so I'll pop in and get a cup of coffee. I show up, and 2 minutes later, this woman who had the needle in her arm sidles up to the bar next to me, and my son introduces us and said, I thought maybe you could talk to her. So what I said to her was, give me your phone number if you want help, and I'll get you somebody who's got the problem and gotten sober, and they will call you, and I'll find you a young woman who can tell you what it's like. It's not me, but I know those people. They can help. And it makes a difference. She got sober for a while. I don't know if she stayed sober. Wasn't somebody I knew very well. But you see how it works. Yeah, in the back. Oh my God, I have no idea. What are the statistics of marriages making it, if there's an alcoholic spouse or an addict spouse? So, you know, I don't know if that study's been done. I think that the couple has a chance of making it if somebody gets sober, right? And I see that I have seen a lot more successful marriage repair if they're in a community where other people have done that work, so that they can be around other people who are working to recover as a couple. I will also say that back in the day, they used to have the different spouses go to therapy and just ride the same tracks but be on different rails. That's how they described it. And now they send couples to therapy very early on. So therapy can be really helpful to dig out at the front end. Yeah, I mean, therapy is great. It's not enough for most people. But it's enough for some people. So I'm, you know, fortunately, the thing you learn in Al-Anon, I've learned is I'm not God. Oh my God, such a relief. When I walked in, I didn't know that. Yeah, so the piece that's missing is community in therapy, especially, you know, the one-on-one stuff. It's great, and I will tell you, lots of people in the program need to do both. Lots and lots and lots of people in the program need both if they want to really fully recover, if they want to get resolution on their childhood stuff. That stuff's complicated, you know. I mean, I work with a lot of trauma now in my work. And those patterns, I mean, it's so hard to begin to break those patterns. You just don't know, and then your buttons get pushed, and then you know, ugh. So how do you do that? You get people who are specialists and know how to treat that stuff, treat addiction, treat trauma, treat family systems. Yes, sir. Yeah, so I am no therapist, and borderline personality disorder, I'd run to a therapist. Just deal with that with them. That's very complicated. I'm not a specialist. And so the question was about, you know, these things that relate to alcoholism. What about if it's a borderline personality disorder? I will tell you that when I did my early training in chemical dependency and understanding all this stuff, I remember raising my hand and going, can it be like this in a family if a parent is schizophrenic? Because I was working with a kid who had all these characteristics, and the family description was the same. And they said, yeah, dysfunctional family system. You know, so the system may look the same, but how to address the problem would look different. Does that make sense? You might see the same characteristics. They may have a borderline personality disorder and have a chief enabler, and they may play the roles in the family, but how you deal with a borderline personality disorder, you got to find somebody who knows that, and that's not. Okay, and I will stick around if you want to just talk to me.